Call on Government Order of the Day number 4.
Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill, committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker. Morena and good morning. Kia ora tātou, no reira te whare, inga iwi, inga rio, inga hawe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Honourable members, the House is in committee this morning on the Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill, and the question before the committee is that Part 1 stand part, and just to inform members that this relates to clauses 4 through to 11. I seek the call from some honourable member. I'm not the committee.
No, Mr. Chairman.
I call the honourable member, Dr. David Clark.
Kia ora, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the call. I rise to speak to this bill. Labor will be opposing this bill, and we do so with some concern, given that generally there's a history of bipartisan conversations on these bills, and given that it's about the long-term health of New Zealand's finances, we had hoped that an agreement could be reached between the two sides of the House who have over many years shared concern for fiscal responsibility. I have a number of questions for the Minister and the Chair, and so I hope that she will take a call on some of the finer aspects of the Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill. And they relate directly to Part 1, because that is the part that we are now debating. Part 1 lays out the principles of responsible fiscal management. And these principles, in one sense, are motherhood and apple pie. But it seems to me to be a complete nonsense to say that past governments haven't had an eye or regard to these issues. And Mr. Chair, if I can hold up this graph to the House, I'm not sure whether members will be able to see it, whether you'll be able to see it from there, Mr. Chair, but it's a graph of New Zealand's debt track. Now, it's a particular cut on it, and I might like to cut it differently, but the general trend shows that the national government in the early 80s had brought New Zealand's debt very high up. It had dropped down over time as the Labor government intervened in the 80s, and the national government of the 90s brought the debt down a little further. The Labor government, of course, the last Labor government we know, ran 9 years of surpluses and really brought New Zealand's debt under control. And then at the end we have this flick in the tail where we see the global financial crisis kicking in. We don't blame the government for all of the irresponsible borrowing that's gone on. Some of it, in fact, was quite responsible. And as Bill English said, of the Labor government's efforts, this is the rainy day that we were waiting for. This is why we saved, so that we could indeed spend when we were in a difficult spot. Now, that spending, though, seems to have gone on without a real plan for the economy, and we don't see the growth that we might have expected from it. But it seems to me a nonsense that these principles in Part 1 were not considered by previous governments that brought this track down. Governments of both stripes, actually. I mean, the real concerns we have are at the beginning, with the national government of the 80s throwing the debt up and the current government throwing the debt up, both without a real plan for the economy. But it's true that in between there was one more responsible national government in terms of the debt track, and two very responsible Labor governments. So these principles, and we read here in number 4, formulating revenue strategy with regard to efficiency and fairness. Now, we can debate whether efficiency and fairness are being adhered to and what precisely those words mean. And that would be a political debate, I suspect, because I would not find that the tax cuts in 2010 were particularly fair, where 40% of the value of the tax cuts that the government brought in went to the top 10% of earners, and those at the bottom got just 2%, the bottom 20% got 2% of the value of the tax cuts, and then all of that was swallowed up in cost of living, GST increases. We all remember GST going up to 15% after the Prime Minister said it would not go up. And so we'd debate about whether and what fairness meant and efficiency in para 4 there, but these same principles were being, I'm sure, debated by various previous governments as we observe that debt track, including the predictability and stability of tax rates. Now, this current government may be an exception, and it may be that the Treasury here with this legislation and other drivers of this legislation are trying to rein in the current government. They may have concerns behind the scenes, and they may be trying to impose a little discipline on this populist government to say, look, if you are going to spend this money, you must have a forward picture. You must, Mr Speaker, not you, but this government must have a forward picture in respect of the predictability and stability of tax rates. If we move through to the next principle, a fiscal strategy with regard to interaction with monetary policy, and particularly the one that relates to future generations. I think that what sits behind this wording perhaps is actually a concern from the Treasury as to how this government is performing. Now, Mr Chair, that is wonderful and ironic, but I don't think this piece of legislation, Mr Chair, will... Mr Chairman.
I call the honourable member.
I don't think this piece of legislation will stop that. So the likely regard to the impact on present and future generations is a genuine concern that we in the Labour Party share. However, again, this government has taken some calls on superannuation. The Prime Minister has said that he will not increase the superannuation age while he is the Minister in charge of the government. Now that is appalling. That is absolutely appalling. We know that the cost of superannuation is overtaking the costs of education in our country. That's education before school, that's education in school, the compulsory sector, that is education in the tertiary sector. It now costs, or soon will cost, more for our super requirements. Now, we need a super scheme in this country that is affordable and that has longevity, because on this side of the House, we are concerned that everybody can have a fair retirement, where their needs, their basic needs, are looked after. Now, we encourage other people to save more, there's no doubt about that, but we have a regard to the long-term impact and future generations. Now, this current government, ironically, seems to be the one that does it, and that's why I say maybe this piece of legislation is an attempt by the Treasury to rein them in. We used to talk about the debt anchor when I worked at Treasury, that idea that the net debt would go down, or sorry, the government debt would go down through 20%, and the last government pretty much got there and left zero net debt for the current government. So there is some irony that these are the objectives being put forward by the current government. And I would ask the Minister and the Chair for her view on whether these particular principles have been ignored by past governments, because I think facts suggest that they have not. And I think this legislation brings nothing new. In fact, it's using parliamentary time to pass legislation that doesn't add much new and that doesn't have the agreement across the House. Now that, to me, seems wrong. That doesn't seem like what we should be doing here as parliamentarians. It ought to be, in my view, that we can agree a long-term strategy for the health of the country in order to take this forward. The other thing that needs mentioning, certainly in respect of this, is that part of the proposal in terms of the sustainability of spending over time that the government was bringing was with its Support Party Act. It was considering putting in a spending cap across government finances, and that spending cap, should it have been implemented, would have had devastating consequences. Now, Mr Chair, I'm very pleased that that was thrown out as a ludicrous idea along the way. I'm sure that it was considered at Select Committee further, but I'm glad that it hasn't made its way back into the bill, because that type of cap has been demonstrated overseas to lead to a lack of investment in infrastructure, in education spending, social infrastructure, and those other things which are actually about that long-term sustainability. And I'm sure the Minister and the Chair would agree that that long-term sustainability doesn't warrant that kind of spending cap, or at least I hope she would. It does seem, though, possible that there is an expediency thing here. Peter Dunn was the man who stepped away from that clause. It was something that National and ACT had agreed in their proposed arrangements before the election, the confidence and supply agreements. So, again, there's a bit of an irony in these principles being here, sitting here, when the kinds of suggestions that have been put forward by the government in its confidence and supply agreements would undermine these exact principles. So that covers the principles that are there. The last one, H4H, ensuring that the Crown's resources are managed effectively and efficiently. Well, who would disagree with that? I don't think anyone in this House would disagree with that. And I don't think, again, Mr Chairman, that the previous legislation would have precluded such a thing taking place. I think that is, again, what this graph that I held up earlier for members demonstrates, that various governments of different stripes, both Labour and National, have had concern for the long-term debt track of New Zealand. Of course, the national governments that have sent us in the wrong direction outnumber the Labour ones that have sent us in the right direction, I would argue. But I'm not making a blanket statement here. I'm saying there are good national governments and bad national governments, and that doesn't matter what it has been in this past legislation. That has still happened. So, Mr Chair, with those thoughts, I will take my seat and look forward to what the next speaker has to say.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman,